Hey everybody, this is Chuck here for deucescrack.com. Welcome to the beginning Omaha 8, this first installment, the pre-flop approach. This series is going to cover pretty much everything you need to know about Limit Omaha 8 or better, my favorite game. I certainly like to think my best game, a game near and dear to my heart, and one that I'm excited to get to talk about for as long as you'll listen. A little bit about this particular video. We're going to be introducing the game of Omaha 8 or better, so if you're familiar with it, just feel free to skip over a little bit of the beginning. Then we're going to learn how to evaluate pre-flop hand strength, and from there, just discuss our early position opening range, specifically dealing with full ring in the early range, and in later installments, we'll, move our way over to six-handed and eventually heads-up pre-flop play. That's a big reason why, and I'm going to talk about in this first bullet here of why to play 08. A big reason why I do love playing 08 is because I think you kind of need to know all of those pre-flop things. It's not too common, you may find now, especially if you're an online player. If you go to the casino, there will be a good amount of small stakes, full ring, live 08 going. Online, there will be a couple of games, but every now and then you end up trying to start games and create games. And I find a lot of players that are big fans of 08 are kind of forced to play in more shorthanded situations, and they don't play so well. And that goes back to, of course, the man who taught me the very beginnings of 08, Mr. Joe Tall, and his famous saying, "Games are good, Chuck." I would regularly scratch my head when I saw how players played certain hands, and Joe's answer was always, "Games are good." In other words, other players don't necessarily know what they're doing. And the phrase I like to use, especially when comparing it to No Limit Hold'em, is unevolved. No Limit Hold'em, for as long as I've been not only playing poker, but teaching poker, has changed so much. Now, a lot of the math and the fundamentals and all of those things are just incredible and so solid, and all that stuff's here on Deuces Cracked. But what we've done over the years to add to the library, to add to the rest of the things you need to learn, that's the game evolving. That's the game changing. Now, most of the 08 content on the internet is here on Deuces Cracked, so I know it really hasn't changed that much, and I know from the games I play, and the games are still very good. I can attest to the release of this video, at least, that the game quality exists for any stake that I'm capable of getting action at. It's not uncommon to see even players that you may have respect for just make completely egregious fundamental errors. Just wow. And that's a good opportunity for anyone in the poker world to try to bolster their bankroll, to try to have more low variance, enjoyable sessions. On the topic of low variance, increasing game selection is a part of decreasing your variance in terms of being a poker player. Any incredibly tough game is obviously going to be higher variance for you. So when we can find a softer game, now the variance might not be different, but when you have a higher win rate, the variance you feel is actually lower. So putting yourself in profitable situations, it could just be good for your poker mental health overall. I know I talk a lot about confidence bankroll, which is just how much confidence you actually have. Having games that you really can dominate is very good for you. Every time I run incredibly poorly at one game, or play poorly, because sometimes you just have a bad session, it's always nice for me to mix it up, kind of give myself a break. It's a nice, easy bounce back. And finally, a huge part of this is I really think that learning split pot games, or just a second game and better in general, will make you such a better poker player. There are so many situations that come up in LO8 that I am so comfortable in because they happen so much more often in Limit Omaha 8 or better, but they don't happen as often in other games. For example, defending incredibly wide in the blinds and flopping a mediocre hand 6 ways. How often does that happen when it goes bet in like a bunch of calls? All these crazy things, these really intricate situations you have to navigate yourself through, end up being a really strong exercise in basic poker theory. You learn a lot more about position. You learn a lot more about jamming equities, and it's just a great exercise. So all these reasons, if I haven't sold you yet, well, you're still with me. So let's go to the 08 basics. First and foremost, what makes a split pot game different, right? If I was to take anyone who's interested in poker and I wanted to learn them teach them a split pot game, the low is a very real part of the pot. It's half of the pot. It also creates sort of polarizing post-flop situations where there either is going to be a split pot or the high probability of a split pot. I have folded lows when it goes bet, raise, raise, and lo and behold, it's just set, set, set. But the fact that that is going to happen is going to change the way we do some poker math in a lot of situations. Drawing to a naked flush, a lot of those flush draw outs could give your opponents lows, which really can chomp into your equity. So paying much more close attention to the pot size is going to be paramount, right? We definitely need to be doing that. As well as just acknowledging what kind of post-flop situations that can create, right? You can't have a situation in a non-split pot game where you think you have the second best low, but know you can get one of the lows to fold, so you want to raise to isolate the player behind you. I hope that doesn't sound too complicated, but this is the kind of fun stuff that can happen in 08 that really can't happen elsewhere. So a lot of it's going to be about reading board textures, which, again, the better you get at it will improve your hold'em game. And then interacting with other players and how they read those board textures. Another big plus to playing this second game, and we're not going to talk about this exclusively the whole series, but specifically Omaha 8 or better, is you get to see other ways in which players can make mistakes. Right? In Texas Hold'em, people can take certain actions that they justify, right? Oh, I made a gigantic 3-bet preflop with aces because I didn't want anyone to call, which doesn't really make sense. That's technically a mistake, right? We want to get action with our aces preflop. But that's the type of bad logic that we can shine a light on to exploit opponents later. We're going to see similar versions of that in Omaha 8 or better. And translating that on times can help us. I mean, it helps me in my PLO game and my Hold'em game every week. The second thing to understand about Omaha is it's a 4-card game, and 4 cards is more cards. What that means for those of you inexperienced is the nuts are much more prevalent. The average strength of hand on the river, just in terms of high-only hand, is very, very strong. Now, because everyone's obsessed with only making lows, we can take that to it, that could be advantageous for us in certain situations when we can play high-only hands, but the important thing to remember is, especially in a loose game, this is going to create a lot of situations for us where when we're out of position, we're not going to be comfortable betting because we get called in, greater than 1 spots. We have much less than the nuts and we don't really know what to do. And especially in a limit variant, you end up bloating pots to the point where folding could be completely incorrect. So it makes it a lot more interesting in a lot of those spots. But finally, it's important to remember it's all still poker, right? Everything you know about Hold'em, everything you know about any game, this maybe you only play 5-card draw or whatever, anything about protecting your range and all those situations and all of that should translate over. So I would say if you've played a lot of other poker, no matter what variant, you're probably ahead of the curve. And if you're just kind of looking to get started, should be a fine place to learn. When I actually worked with Joe, he thought that coming over from Limit Hold'em would make it a lot easier for Omaha 8 or better. I think actually PLO is probably an easier transition just because you get used to the 4-card game a lot more. Curious to hear your thoughts. Now, let's dive into how to gauge hand strength, right? What actually makes a good hand in Limit Omaha 8 or better? Well, I picked all in the same suit because first and foremost, suitedness and nutty suitedness is always going to be awesome, right? Suited aces are always good. In a game that is incredibly tough to board read and player read, a 4-card game with loose players, having indisputable evidence that you have the strongest hand, easiest way to do that is with a flush, is always good. And obviously, because it's a high-low game, we want cards that can work for the high side and the low side. There's only one card that can do that. That's the ace. So the ace is the most powerful. It may seem as though the 8 is unintentionally cut off, but I intentionally cut off the 8 because as we're moving from left to right, the strength of these cards is actually going down, which is not something that's completely parallel to a Hold'em game. If I have an ace and a 2, I'd always take a 3 in my hand instead of not always, but almost always, probably always actually take a 3 in my hand instead of an 8. Those last bunches of cards are helpful, that's 6, 7, 8. But we're most focused on these first 5 cards, these wheel cards. Ace to 5 straight would be a wheel. Now the 6, 7, 8 that I've left out, emergency low, if you want to call it. The 6 is not nearly as bad. It's right next to the 5. which means it can help make some straights with the 5-6. It's not just an order and a pretty thing and their hearts and yada yada. It's the fact that these cards can work together. A great Omaha 8 or better hand has 4 cards that are all doing work to help it. Right? If you think about it, if you are bringing any group to get a job done and someone says you got 4 slots, no one says, well, give me 3, and then the last one, I mean, just pay that guy, who cares, or girl, who cares? We don't care what they do. We want all the cards doing something. And as you see here, if we do have some kind of ace-2 hand, a 5 is always going to be helping it. And if we have a 5 in there, a 6 can help it too, because now we can have some higher straights. An 8 can kind of help it. A 7 can kind of help it, but not nearly as much. So having these wheel cards is very good. Then we get to the loneliest card in the deck, the 9, which I truly do think deserves to stand on its own. Unfortunately, the 9 really is as bad as advertised. And I say that because a lot of 08 instruction is dated well beyond anything anyone thinks. The Hutchinson point count system, which is like a semi-famous pre-flop point calculating system, is allegedly from an article in 1977 from Card Player magazine in Canada. I read that today. And a lot of that advice, I mean, that stuff's fine. And if the games are that dated, it still works. So honestly, probably the better players in your game might be reading that material and advancing. But we're obviously moving past that. And the one thing I think is kind of interesting is just how bad 9s are. I remember speaking with Tommy Angelo and him we're talking Omaha 8 or better. And he just shook his head and goes, I don't know, just fold anything with a 9, right? And he's a little closer to right than, he was obviously kidding. Tommy's an excellent poker player. But he's a little closer to right than we kind of want to acknowledge here. 9s really are very bad cards for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, this is an Omaha game, so you do need to use 2 cards. Now let's pair our ace with some wheel cards in our mind here, and now let's throw that 9 in. And instead of a 9, let's give that ace any other card here, a 10, Jack, Queen, King. Immediately, any Broadway board combination, and I know this doesn't sound like much, but if you just change the 9 for a 10, which is a pip, any Jack, Queen, King combo on the flop gives us a nut gut shot. Just those 2 cards, Queen, Jack, King, Jack, King, King, Queen, any of those. And with any other Broadway card. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but the 9 really just does nothing for us there. And if we go back to the nuttiness and the fact that we are playing a 4-card game, 9X, we just end up on so many board textures where our hand cannot scoop. We want hands. What really makes a good hand is hands that can scoop. And scoop just means, those of you unfamiliar, win the high and the low. Now, that's easy to do with high card only hands when just the high comes in. But even then, if we have a high card only hand with the 9, there are so many fewer board textures, and we can work out the math here, but I would suggest just trusting me, that include these types of cards in making the nuts: 7s, 8s, and 9s. As we move more and more towards shorthanded play, where a lot of players are going to be calling us, and we end up in a lot of situations where we need to be aggressive and barreling and have a good balanced range on a lot of streets, we find out that these 3 cards just really don't pull their weight very often. 7s, maybe, but a lot of what we're trying to play is some combination of I can make low straights and flushes and high straights and flushes. And then if I make full houses with those cards, that's great. But any board with 7, 8, 9 on the straight, guess what? 7, 8, 9 flop, there's Jack 10 for the high straight. Or I'm sorry, let's say 5, 6, 7 flop. 8, 9, that straight is now fighting against the ace 2s and the ace 3s that are jamming that maybe shouldn't be. We need to prepare for our opponent's mistakes, not yell at them while we hold a hand and hope they fold, right? We don't care that people are going to put a lot of money in with worse hands there. What we don't want to be is the person calling and hoping our hand holds up while everyone else just shoves a bunch of money in with chunks of the pot. Not a good place to be in. And on that note, just a couple of things that are really bad and important to avoid in multi-way Omaha 8 or better. First and foremost, small pocket pairs. They really are terrible. On that note of other cards not working, anytime you flop a small set, that means there's now 1 low card out there. We need only 2 more for there to be a low on board. Now, let's say there's not more than 2 low cards out there. That means we have 3 cards that are all 9 or greater. So 9 through king. And if there's 3 of those, that means they're either paired or there's a straight possible amongst those 5 cards, right? 9, 10, jack, or 9, queen, king, or queen, queen, 9. That gives us an underfull, or that gives us a set on a straight board. These situations are all just awful for us. I mean, again, in a shorthanded situation, and we're going to do a lot of spots when we play some small pocket pairs, but what we want to be covering, especially when it comes to these like large multi-way situations, is just the logic behind what maybe we would want to play a hand, what would maybe make us want to play a hand versus not play a hand, so that when we are in a unique situation and, the game just filled up and I'm under the gun, I don't know these 4 people, I've got ace 4, 4, 8 rainbow under the gun, that's a trivial fold for us now, because we know the small pocket pair is bad. I'm not even thinking, there's 2 wheel cards. Second, middling cards. I showed you before the 7, 8s, and 9s, and the more players in the pot, the worse it gets. When there's that many players in the pot, a big part of our profit is going to come from jamming. It's going to come from pushing other people along with us in the pot. We need to have hands that can increase equity. That can push their equity edge. And middling cards in general are not going to help us with that very often. At all, if ever. I'm not saying I'm only raising the nuts. What comes to mind maybe be like a rainbow 6, 9 on a 7, 8, 10, but I'm raising there a lot. But it's still it can get very dicey. And the middling cards are the types of hands that you can go both ways with it, right? You can just say, I'll figure it out post flop. But more important is that we prepare ourselves for these awkward situations, and just dumping hands with those type of cards in them in general is going to be much better. As tempting as ace 7, 7, 8 with an 8 high suit is from late position after a bunch of calls, that hand is so much worse than you think, simply because it has no nutty potential and so many middling cards, and those get way worse in multi-way 08. And I even snuck a small pocket pair in there. In general, it comes down to non-nut potential. In PLO, people are so terrified of not having the nuts. If you have played any amount of live PLO, you know that the games can be incredibly loose and passive with a lot of calling, and the only thing people raise is the nuts. Well, the 4-card game logic translates here very often to Omaha 8 or better. So we want hands that can make the nuts. We're taking post-flop awkward situations and using them to help us from the beginning, just the way you would formulate a game plan in any other game. I like calling Hold'em other games now, in this video at least. So how do we avoid these spots? Well, specifically in large and multi-way pots, we want to avoid non-nut potential. Now, I've put it in quotes here because this would be one of the main things people do wrong in shorthanded situations, is now not embrace the fact that you don't need the nuts. In the same way that on a full ring table, if I bet on a king 7-2 rainbow and get called in 3 spots, you better believe at least one person has a king. If I get check called on that same board, heads up in a Hold'em scenario, it's a lot more. It could be ace highs, could be some floats. Ranges are going to get wider. So it's important that we keep these very strict rules in our head, and we prepare this first part of the series where we're getting ready for early position play, and then get ready to slowly shave it away. But the easiest way to do that is knowing what makes a hand good. So now, when I know what the premium hands are from early position, I know that if I have a small pocket pair, I'm in late position, but it's not as good. That's a little bit worse. I know the 9 is a bad card. Adding a wheel card to my hand would be good. I just think it's very important to be able to navigate pre-flop in Omaha 8 or better, because it can get really gross real fast, right? Top pair on a low draw board, all these other things. Now, in an effort to kind of make it easier to talk about 08 and really just show you how I compartmentalize hands in my head a little bit, I want to go over the shorthanded notation I use. This is right off Pro Poker Tools. And we're going to use this to make 4-card hands, where obviously an A would be an ace. A W is a wheel card. When I'm talking about wheel cards, I'm talking about 2, 3, 4, and 5. So AW would be ace wheel. A B is a Broadway, so 10, Jack, Queen, King. And those last lovely cards we have there would be middling. Now, this is a little bit dangerous, right? I've got aces, which is great, but then I've used one letter W to characterize 4 cards, and the same with the B and M, and there really is a significant difference between them as things change, right? Ace 2 is very different than Ace 5, as is Ace 2, 6, 7 versus Ace 2, 8, 9, both of which would be Ace Wheel, middle, middle. Now, we know which of these is the best cards. Right now, we're particularly focusing on wheel and middle. I'll touch on Broadway, obviously, before we advance through this slide, but it should be clear that what makes a hand better would be better wheels. So Ace 2 is better than Ace 3, just as Ace 3 is better than Ace 5. Now, Ace middle, when we're talking, especially from early position, we're talking more like Ace 2, 6, Ace 3, 6 type hands. Those middling cards, I'll be very specific when I touch on what that middling card can do to the hand. There is a tremendous difference. I had to put 9 somewhere. We could have made it all by itself, but I'm not going to just include 9s. But there's a tremendous difference between a 9 and an 8. And I know it doesn't seem like it, but it's much more important when you get to shorthanded, when that emergency low, when we're making really thin value bets with like 2 pair on a low draw board because we know we're getting called by any low, and the Ace 8 is actually really good because you can call a check raise. Much more important down the road. In terms of Broadways, Broadways are always good. They're very strong. In general, when you have a more Broadway heavy hand, like an Ace Broadway, Broadway with a wheel, those are going to be better heads up just because, or in a shorter handed situation, because it has more high card potential. If you think about it, I always like to envision those hands as like a big, strong pillar where they can take a lot more pounding because they're going to have top pair a lot. And if they don't have top pair, they have a low. There's a lot of board textures they have a lot of durability on. Now, in multi-way situations, when we're talking about Broadways, you have to think of Ace Queen 10 offsuit differently than you do Ace Queen 10 suited. Simultaneously, Ace King 10 is different than Ace Jack 10. And you want to be thinking about it in terms of the multi-way playability of those hands. How does that translate from game to game? Having suited and connected, especially with the Broadways, is going to be good for us here. But in general, those cards add a lot of upper end strength and just a solid addition to the hand. Any real combination of A, B, W is going to be good, as we're going to see. Now, to talk about the shorthanded a little bit, and a big concern of mine is just people taking things the wrong way. So I want to make sure we cover what these all could mean. So the first one here, ace wheel, wheel, wheel. Now, that's an easy shorthanded way to represent just ace and 3 wheel cards. But there are very different types of ace and 3 wheels. We have all the way on the left, which I would consider like an ultra premium, ace 2, 3, 4. It's just a great ace wheel, wheel, wheel card. The second you start pairing them, obviously we see now that our hand is of much less strength. The hand on the first hand there, I'm excited to play, right? I'm probably raising that almost always, raising it out of the small blind. And again, we'll focus more on pre-flop as we continue here. As opposed to now we pair our 4. We know a paired 4 is just very bad. Of course, we still have ace and 3 wheels. That's a good situation. So this is still going to be bordering on playable hand. Once you start including the very, very worst of it, right? Ace 2, 2, 2 is technically ace and all wheels. That's just not a very good hand though. And that should be kind of clear. So if you have any questions about any shorthanded ones, well, let's keep working through. Same way here, ace Broadway, Broadway wheel. If ace BB wheel is playable from a situation, it could be as premium as ace 2 Queen Jack, which obviously has tremendous multi-way playability. Ace King King 3, which also has tremendous multi-way playability just because we have a strong pair of kings. I've ignored suits here. Any addition of suits, obviously, should add a lot of value to our hand in terms of the multi-way playability of it. But Broadway, Broadway wheel technically does include hands like ace 10, 10, 5. That is a much worse version of ace King King 3. So we don't want to just completely group these. I have a few more, so we might as well move on. Ace middle, middle wheel. Again, ace 9 8 5 versus ace 9 9 2 versus ace 8 7 5. Kind of mix it up in here a little bit. Of all the hands here, I would like to play the ace 9 9 2 the most because ace 2 does have the best multi-way playability. And yes, my pocket nines are garbage and they're two of the worst cards, but my set of nines can play well multi-way. My ace 5 low is very unlikely to be the best in a multi-way pot. And these other two cards, 8 9 7 8, are still middling cards that don't really do much here. So I'm more excited about the upgrade on my low end than I am on any kind of potential upgrade connectivity that my other high cards have. Ace 8 7 5, by the way, premium button steel hand. And a BMW, Ace Broadway, middle wheel. Again, same thing, can be very, very different. Ace Jack 9 2 would be pretty close to the Ace Broadway wheel. We see there the middling card is actually a little bit of help, right? The fact that 7 8 10 is on the flop, those are, and I understand that that's just one type of board texture, but you have to think of it in terms of flopping 7 9 queen. Now you have a gut shot with the nuts, gut shot to the nuts plus a low draw. You've now given yourself 4 more outs, and those 4 outs, by the way, are scoop outs. And the last thing I want to talk on here, I wanted to make one more point on the 9 versus the 8, and I think this is a pretty premium example. The 9 on the right there, Ace King 9 5, does no help in making straights. All it can potentially do is make more pairs, as opposed to the 8, which can make some nutted straights. 4 6 7 is a nutted straight. 5 through 9 makes no nutted straights, which again would mean that there could be no combos of ace, wheel, 9 Broadway that have low nutted straights, which is a problem on some board textures. Also, the 8 does provide an emergency low for maybe we flop trip kings and river kings full of 5s. It's nice to have any kind of low in there when you're facing other high-only hands that could potentially be scooping you. I don't mean to kick a 9 while it's down, but when you have the opportunity. So the real point here was that we're using this shorthanded notation, but were you to maybe be able to hack it with a fringe case, i.e. ace, wheel, 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 when it's ace and all 2s, I wouldn't worry about that spot too much. It's kind of just a garbage hand. And no matter how much we do assign hands to these buckets, we do want to have that one last stop. All right, when I get ace, king, 9, 5, I don't know if I want to raise. Even if the 9 was an 8, maybe I'd raise it here. That is probably the fringiest of fringe situations that likely will not come up. But we can make more exaggerated examples of that as we continue on. So let's jump into early position. We're going to focus mainly on full ring, opening, and limping. As we have the premium ace, ace, 2, 3 double suited. Now, when I say full ring, opening, and limping, I really just want to focus today on these 3 seats up front here. This is a 9-handed game. Again, as I mentioned earlier, most full ring action, it's not, the games, I hope one day this is wrong, but typically the games, when they do run, if it's full ring, there's a player or two sitting out or a short stack or things like that. The action is just not nearly as prevalent, but you still want to be prepared for these spots, and this is really where we want to have the most solid fundamentals for a lot of the reasons. We'll talk about them. In early position, what exactly is happening in early position? One of my favorite things to say, there's uncertainty behind us. And this is so true, especially when you're just sitting down for the first orbit or when 3 or 4 players sit behind you. There can be just an endless cast of characters at an Omaha 8 or better table. And the fact that all of these other players can be playing so strangely behind us means we need to be prepared for it with strong holdings. Case in point, we need strong hands, as I said. That being said, limping is a very real option. In general, I do not like open limping much in games. If you played poker for any amount of time, you know you do not open limp much, if ever, in most games. That being said, there are just certain players and there are certain games that you can still get away with it. If I was to open limp from early position in a no-limit game, I think a lot of people would recognize exactly what my range is and then potentially adjust their post-flop game plan. But even though I'm just only limping certain bad hands from early position and playing the flop face up, it's a game that lends itself to exploiting your opponents. I think would be the most succinct way to wrap up that point. So I can obviously just go ahead and limp there with impunity with some hands. In general, though, early position range is going to equal premium hands for all of those reasons we mentioned before, for everyone behind us, and really for a respect for the post-flop situations you're going to find yourself in. Because players, you have a lot of tight players, and we do not want to be playing a game where we're betting, not knowing if we're getting half of that back, none of that back, a quarter of that back. Don't want to fold. Again, it's a limit game, and players can jam high only or low only. So now we don't want to be out of position with what? We don't want to be out of position with the second best high and the second best low, and a bunch of players and no idea what to do with it. And the easiest way to avoid that is to stick to premium hands in early position. So what are premium hands? What do premium hands look like in Omaha 8 or better? First, let's just talk about pocket aces. I think that if you want to talk premiums, the top tier, you've got aces with a wheel. That other card, once you start hitting aces with a wheel, and that second card is an unpaired wheel card or it's suited, so just nut aces with any suited aces with any wheel card, I'm raising that with impunity from early position all the time. You do have two of the aces, which is a very big part of people having better low draws behind you. They need ace 2, ace 3, ace 4. The more you play 08, one great thing to look out for is as board textures pan out, think how much tougher a non-ace low is going to have it here. And a big part of it too can also be card removal, wherein I have two aces, no one player is much less likely to have one, so I'll feel a little bit more comfortable betting my low because I can hand read a little bit better. But those hands are that good. Having the aces to play for the high is usually very, very easy. And yes. And really in no particular order here, but ace 2, wheel Broadway, unpaired and suits. I'm trying to kind of stipulate here a little bit. I didn't want to just say ace, wheel Broadway, because then we start throwing in like ace 4, 4, king. But like ace 2, wheel Broadway, suited would be on the premium side. You don't necessarily need the nut suit with it. That's obviously would be the best. I think any kind of ace 2 wheel with a Broadway suit I'm playing from early position in your tighter, tougher games. No, I'm still playing that hand. Now let's compare that to ace 2 Broadway. I say pairs are better because here ace 2 Broadway, I can't actually have a paired wheel, right? So pocket 10s through kings are a lot better, a lot easier to play. It lends itself to a lot of just dry board textures. Another thing that happens quite often in Omaha 8 or better is when there is a low draw on the board, people tend to get stubborn with their weak pair plus weak low draw type hands. And then they end up on the river with exactly what they don't want, which is the second best high and the second best low. And being able to bet a hand like ace 2, jack on a king high board with a low and scoop is excellent. It just adds more value to your hand. These obviously play much better heads up. Facing some raises, this is the type of hand I might consider 3-betting, like an ace, king, king 2, wherein maybe you don't necessarily want to 3-bet an ace 2 Broadway wheel because of the multi-way playability of it, right? There's more board textures I can really crush. And when you've got a stranglehold in a board, you've got something you can jam. And finally, ace 2 suited plus premium additions. I say that because you can look at hands like ace 2, 9, 10 double suited. I would put that somewhere close to it. Ace 2, 3, 6 king, right? There can be some middling cards in there, but if it's double suited. So I don't want you to just completely see anything with a 6 through 9 in your early position range and go, wow, throw it out. Absolutely not. If the other parts of your hand, along with your ace 2 suited, now it doesn't need to be ace of spades, 2 of spades, I can have ace of spades, 4 of spades, and the 2 of hearts, and the 9 of hearts. That's a double suited hand. It's got a middling card, but I've got 2 wheel cards with it, ace 2 wheel with a suit. That would be something I would consider a premium addition. Both of those cards, basically any kind of ace 2, where it's also working along with my hand. Moving on to some more premium type holdings that I'm actually considering playing from early position. Now, what about worse aces? I think this is probably the number one question I get about people at early position pre-flop range. What do I do with aces? The easy ones, those are easy, right? We just discussed those. Your aces need some help. I understand that aces are incredible and they're a great hand, but ace, 9, 7 rainbow from early position, or ace, I mean, that one's pretty bad. Yeah, any of those type hands. Just, you want a little bit of help with them. Otherwise, you don't want to be playing a hand that you are literally only hoping either A, everyone folds, or B, you flop top set and then there's no low out there as well. As we can have top set, aces have more value in that way versus small pair, even though it's technically the bottom one, because we can set over set other people. But you do want some help with your hand. So some sort of wheel card. Truthfully, I'm raising probably any ace wheel from early position. Doesn't have to be suited. I think in the early going, on the tighter side is fine. Don't be afraid to fold pocket aces, though. It's really not that big of a deal. Bad queens are awful here. Bad kings are really bad. And bad aces are not that much better. I don't know. It's a bit of a hang up maybe coming from other games, more common games, so to speak. But your aces do need some help. So you want a suit to go along with it, some sort of low potential. Now it's a give and take too. I said I'd probably play ace, any wheel, rainbow. So now if we want to add more hands to aces, what would I play? Oh, well, give me maybe a 6 and a good Broadway hand with a suit, like ace, queen 6 with a suit. If I don't have maybe if I have a 7, I want a very, very good card with it. But then you're, especially like 9-hand under the gun, you're hitting unplayable because you need to come in for a raise and you're almost banking on several folds behind you because you're going to find yourself on flops. So often you can't continuation bet, but you should. Or you do continuation bet and end up in a huge pot on the turn saying, I don't know what to do. Next, some sort of ace wheel Broadway type hand. Obviously, the worst of this would be an ace 4-5. I've highlighted again, unpaired. We do not want paired hands here. Early small pocket pairs, anytime I'm leaving myself in early position, those small pairs are really, really bad. Just fact. But any kind of ace wheel Broadway hand, we don't necessarily need suits if the wheels are much stronger, right? Ace 2-3 Broadway, ace 2-4 Broadway, even ace 3-4 Broadway. A big plus to that ace 3-4 type hand is any flop with a 2 on it, we now flop. It's very likely we either flop a pair plus nut low draw or uncounterfeitable nut low draw, which just makes for so many fewer situations where you put a lot of money in the pot and then are forced to fold on a later street, which is always going to cost us money. Suited aces plus mediocre help. I think just suited aces in general are too strong for me to fold. Mediocre help. We talked earlier about an ace 2-9-9 hand. Ace 3 suited obviously needs a little bit more help than ace 2 suited, but from early position, I don't really want to be folding many of my suited ace 3s either. We did highlight 3 seats there. And the more I slide a little bit slower from under the gun, maybe I'm under the gun plus 1 or 2, the more excited I'm going to be about raising my ace 3 suited plus Broadways and things like that. Premium non-ace hands too, I think, are going to be playable from early position. I clicked ahead to this bullet point here too because we start hitting a little bit of the type of hands I would probably consider limping. Ace 2 suited premium, ace 2 suited, probably not. Ace 3 suited, premium non-ace hands. By that I mean maybe your double suited kings plus wheel cards, maybe your low only wheel hands that maybe can make some wheel straights, 2 through 6. I might throw some 6x high-end hands in there just because we can have more scoopable straights. Double suited, maybe single suited, but connected, like 2, 3, 4, 5 singles suited. Hands like that are just hands that are likely too good to fold, but I maybe don't want to necessarily build a big pot. And I tend to bunch those hands into my limping range. Why can we limp? Was the question, though. Like, how come some of these hands I don't want to raise? Why do I really want to limp? The cheating answer, if you ask me, the easy one, is it promotes more calls behind. This is something I've observed for a long time now playing poker. I used to do this playing three-handed. I would occasionally limp a button. And my rationale was people then thought it was okay to limp the button. Once I saw someone do it, they thought it was, oh, this table lets me limp the button. And then when they see you limp, maybe this villain thinks, oh, it's a limped pot. I'm going to go ahead and limp along. These are probably dated ideals. These are the types of things that when you do them, and there's a very good, tough player at the table, they punish you so fast. And that's a big reason why you can't really let anyone, no one's going to say, oh, this is my limping range, yada, yada. But most of the time, and especially in the games we're playing now, it does promote some more calls behind. Now, a big part, too, of why we're going to limp is why we're actually so tight in early position. Right? We don't have like an open, wide early position that everyone's going to fold because we have a lot of blockers. I don't want to get 5 calls range. Everything I'm telling you to raise doesn't care if one person calls or the whole table calls. I mean, it does, obviously, because we're going to end up playing bigger pots, higher variance situations when the whole table calls. But we're taking hands that have a lot of strength that can hit a lot of board textures. Now, if we need to be tight because other players are going to call, that means we can be loose sometimes because other players are going to call. So rather than it being a mistake for us, it can just be something that people will let us get away with. A big part of that, though, and a big part of the hands that I'll usually want to be limping, and the situations where I decide I want to limp but I don't want to raise, is our hand wants to see a flop before continuation betting. I know that sounds silly, but let me explain here. By that I mean we don't want to play a very huge pot because we're likely to have something close to the best hand. We're pretty confident it's going to be the best hand. Maybe it's not the most nuttiest of holdings at all points in times, but our hand does want to see a flop. We just don't want to make the pot so big that we really can't ever get away from it. And we're fine just winning a small pot with it every now and then. I would say that from early position, especially these 3 seats, if you're uncomfortable raising any hand that I had said I would play for a raise, you're not going to be making a mistake limping it, especially in a full ring Omaha 8 or better game. My answer is going to change drastically as we move over to the short-handed arena and we start talking about under-the-gun opening range versus cutoff button type things. But for now, I think if you're a beginner, staying on the tight side's fine. I recommend raising, though. Taking initiative. We're going to go through all the post-flop logic, obviously. Taking initiative, as I was saying, is going to be much better. That being said, there are just a lot of hands that, that's why we start including some of those ace-3, X-type hands in there. So now, do I have an early position limping range? Which I think is a fair question. Another one that I get asked quite often. And absolutely. Now, those hands I showed there, most of what I went through, even down to the non-premiums, the suited ace-3s, typically I find myself on the much more aggressive side, and I like to do open raise quite a bit. But there's a lot of hands that are included in there that we did not touch on at all, especially when we want to go through some of that notation, right? Like ace-2 middle. What about an ace-2 6-9 rainbow or an ace-2 7-8 rainbow, ace-2 8-9 rainbow, all these things? We still have an ace-2 in there. There's still some of those premium pieces that really give us a little bit of wiggle room. Any non-premium combinations of those hands earlier, I think, are playable for a limp if you do not want to raise. I also wouldn't hesitate to mix in some more premium offsuit ace-3 type holdings, right? Ace-3 Broadway, ace-3 big pair type things. It's not nearly as good because not nearly as good as the other hand, obviously, but we can still play those hands in a smaller pot at a position. We have less in the pot already, which is a good spot for us. Anything that you do not want to bloat the pot with, that you still consider some combination of those hands, I think is fine to play for a limp within reason. That being said, I would say, especially when you start off early, just playing tight is going to be right. If this is all new to you and the notation and everything here is new, I don't think you're leaving much, if any money on the table by folding a couple of incredibly weak offsuit ace-3 type hands from under the gun. as opposed to maybe limping it and hoping that the other players at the table will let you get away with it. So let's just stick with these raising ranges for now. And let's talk a little bit about early position errors, the type of things I see a lot of players doing that's really just going to cost us money. I talked a little bit there about Ace-3X, and some of them, there's some Ace-3 combos I absolutely will play, but I think bad Ace-3s, especially from early position, can cost you a lot of money. Ace-3, 7-9 Rainbow is pretty close from early position. Maybe a lot of money's overstating it, but open limping with hands that you can very rarely lead flops and just end up in check calling games means you're not going to be in a situation to build a pot when you have the best hand, and you're just going to be hoping to have the best hand when you're check calling. And just that game in general, you want to talk about from a game theory perspective, sub-game, is going to really favor the player in position. So let's try to avoid that. The second one would be 4 small cards. This is a mistake from every which position, but from early position, it's just a travesty. And when I say 4 small cards, we're talking about that top row, really just any combination of 2 through 8, right? We're removing Ace-X. Some of those are different, right? I said premium wheel hands, I'll play all wheel 2, 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 3, 4 double suited in a very good game. Hands that have extra things going for it with what, again, those are parts of what make a Omaha 8 or better hand good. 7-7, 5-3 Rainbow can go in the muck. It's got a small pocket pair. It's got 2 of the worst wheel cards. And yes, it's 4 small cards and it can make a low. The justification it can make a low is exactly the same as saying, technically, not exactly, but is saying 7-2 can make a full house. Like, of course it can. It can. You can have that board texture, and 8-8, 8-6 can make a low on Ace-2, 3, Queen, Queen. Doesn't mean I'm going to put 15 bets in with it. So just because your hand can make a low, by no means, especially from out of position, because when you're out of position, you're hoping your low is best. When I'm in position, I'm hoping you fold your bad high. Something we'll cover obviously more down the road. But the 4 small cards there are just not a great spot. I've seen, players playing, again, those small pair plus weird wheel card combos. Even, as I said before, those ultra premium double suited low runs can actually flop and hammer some boards. But then when you start going into like 4, 5, 6, 7, again, you need exactly Ace-2, 3 on the flop to scoop. And Ace-2, 3 on the board texture to just blatantly scoop, because you need the wheel to go along with it. And it just creates so many fewer situations where we can jam. Create situations where you're looking at your suitedness and it's only worth a blocker, as opposed to, and it's a big difference between those 2, 3, 4X type hands when I can have the nut low and a flush and I can bet and scoop. These 4 small card hands are not scooping hands. The same with really bad Ace-3s that I'm just check calling and trying to figure out if especially for someone new to the game, not going to end well. Second, bad big pairs. I talked a little bit before about folding bad aces. That means we can fold our bad queens, kings, jacks. We're not even dreaming about 9s. Some people maybe think about their 10s. But bad big pairs can just go. Again, it's tough to build pots from out of position, and there's uncertainty behind us. We don't know if people are limping. We don't know if people are calling. I'm not excited about limping queens, like Badoogie, ugly queens from early position. When you start making them double suited, as I talked earlier about double suited kings, maybe if you play a lot and you have a good read in the game, you want to start limping some of those hands. But for now, it's going to be a big mistake to play those hands. Just leaves a lot of awkward guessing. And finally, not raising. I would consider an early position error. We are getting called a lot behind us. I see a lot of players tank, limp ultra premium aces under the gun, or good suited Ace-2s with Broadway combinations that really play well multi-way, or double suited ace wheel XX. We will talk about this ad nauseum when we talk about blind play, but not building the pot, I think, is just going to be a pretty big mistake. Now, this slide, I think, is one of the most important ones here, because we're going to use all of these things, all of these mistakes players are making pre-flop and early position, to dominate late position post-flop play. because now we have a decent idea of the type of junk players can actually have in their range. Believe it or not, players play even more than this stuff from early position, and we're going to use that in later position to maximize our profits. That's it for today. Introduction to Omaha 8 or better. We covered some pre-flop logic, what makes a hand good, what we're thinking about playing from early position. Any questions about the specifics covered in this video, please feel free to post them here on the forums. Shoot me a message on DC. Follow me on Twitter at DCChuck. And I will be back with some more split pot action down the road. Until then, this is Chuck for deucescrack.com, and I'll see you on the forums.